The velvet box was still warm in my hands when my daughter yanked it away and hissed, "This isn't yours, old witch." Still, I didn't move, just let my hand rest on the table where her wedding brunch plates gleamed untouched. As her designer perfume, loud and saccharine, thickened the air, it turned my stomach more than her words. While the sapphire brooch caught the light on her chest, I remembered every gift, every loan, every lie. The same perfume I once gave her for Christmas now smelled like entitlement. That's when I filed the eviction, canceled her cards, and repossessed the life she never earned. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Loretta's hands shook as she held the small velvet-wrapped box. The fabric faded from years of careful handling, but the weight inside was still as precious as it had been the day she bought it. She'd worn the brooch on her wedding day, her something blue, and had kept it ever since, tucked away with her treasures, locked in a drawer but never forgotten. Now it was meant for Kristen, a gesture of love, of reconciliation. After all the years of giving, Loretta thought, perhaps this would be the thing to heal their growing rift. The family had gathered for brunch, the table laden with plates of biscuits, fresh fruit, and a ham that glistened with honey glaze. The sunlight filtered in through the open windows, catching on the silverware, casting a warm glow over the familiar faces. Except for Kristen, Loretta could sense it. The coldness simmering beneath her daughter's perfectly pressed blouse. Amber was filming, of course. Always the dutiful daughter, capturing moments for posterity. Though Loretta could see the nervousness in her eyes as she adjusted her phone. Her granddaughter had always been sweet, though distant at times. But today, Amber seemed like she knew something was coming. Loretta leaned forward, offering the box to Kristen. She gave a soft smile, one that didn't reach her eyes but carried the weight of decades. She had expected this moment for years, but now that it was here, she felt a knot in her stomach, a twist of uncertainty she couldn't shake. Kristen took the box without a word, her fingers slick as she peeled back the paper. The brooch was nestled inside, its sapphire stones sparkling like a distant star. Loretta could see it in Kristen's eyes, the flash of recognition, followed by a flicker of something darker, something meaner. She opened her mouth, then paused, lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "This isn't yours to give, old witch." The words cut through the air, sharp and unforgiving. Kristen yanked the brooch from Loretta's hands, the rough movement pulling the pin out of its velvet cushion. Loretta's fingers twitched, but she didn't react. Couldn't react. Not yet. The room fell still. The cameras kept rolling, the phones clicking. Loretta's breath caught, her pulse quickening in her throat. The way Kristen's eyes gleamed as she posed with the brooch, the way her lips turned upward in a mockery of grace. Loretta felt the sting of it, as though the world had just learned her secret shame. That she'd raised a daughter who would treat her like this, in front of everyone. The murmurs began around the table, a soft ripple of disbelief. Amber's voice, barely a whisper, broke through the tension. "I'm so sorry." But Loretta didn't answer. Her mind was frozen, as if her body had forgotten how to move. She sat still, a statue in the middle of the storm, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like the shadow of something ancient and unforgiving. Kristen laughed, a brittle, high-pitched sound that made Loretta's stomach turn. And then, as if it were nothing more than a cheap piece of costume jewelry, Kristen twisted the brooch onto her blouse. "Family heirlooms just hit different," she announced. A taunt, a public declaration of victory. Loretta's heart pounded in her ears. She felt like a fool. A fool for ever thinking this could end any other way. She rose slowly, her legs stiff as though made of wood. The room was silent now, every eye on her, every glance heavy with judgment, curiosity, or pity. She couldn't tell. She could only hear the ringing in her ears as she walked toward the door, the heavy beat of her own pulse like a drum in her chest. She didn't look back. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that sent a tremor through her bones. It was over. That was the moment she'd been waiting for, and it had come with a crushing weight she hadn't been prepared for. Out on the porch, the wind picked up, rustling the Spanish moss, but Loretta barely noticed. She leaned against the railing, staring out at the quiet street, her breath coming in shallow, measured pulls. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there waiting for the storm inside her to pass. And then, a slow smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, dark and determined. Kristen had made a mistake. A big one. And Loretta? She wasn't about to let it stand. Loretta sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. The house was eerily quiet, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of crickets the only sounds. Her fingers hovered over the old leather-bound ledger, the one she'd kept for years. Kristen, Expenses and Gifts. She'd started it when Kristen had been in her early 20s, a way to track all the things Loretta had given her, all the sacrifices she'd made to help her daughter build a life. A car here, a deposit there, tuition, rent, the townhouse. Loretta flipped the cover open with a snap, and there it was. The neatly penciled list of everything she had ever given Kristen, everything that had been poured into the life Kristen had built. Pearl was across from her, leaning back in her chair, a glass of bourbon in one hand. She watched Loretta's fingers trace the columns of numbers and dates. Her eyes didn't miss a thing. "Start with the townhouse," Pearl said, her voice low but pointed. Loretta glanced up, her gaze hard as granite. "I intend to. It's the one thing she doesn't even know I still control." Pearl let out a small laugh. "She's about to learn a lot more than that." Loretta turned the pages, each one filled with meticulous records, down payments, car loans, every penny she had ever lent or gifted. The townhouse, still in her name, despite Kristen's insistence that it was hers. Loretta's signature was all over it. The legal jargon, the deeds, the proof. Kristen had never bothered to finalize the transfer. She felt a strange satisfaction as she read through the list. It was a cold kind of satisfaction, but it was satisfaction nonetheless. The numbers and receipts were concrete, irrefutable. "Do you want me to make a call to Nico about the property?" Pearl asked, her voice casual, like they were talking about rearranging furniture, not reclaiming a daughter's entire life. Loretta nodded. "Make the call. I want confirmation it's still mine. All of it. The car, the house, the accounts." Her voice grew colder. It's time she learns a hard lesson. Pearl grabbed her phone and dialed, the sharp click of each key punctuating the silence between them. Loretta returned to the ledger, her eyes scanning the entries. Each one reminded her of how long she'd been giving, how long she'd been silently building a foundation for Kristen's success, and how it had all been taken for granted. The kitchen clock ticked in the background, a metronome marking the passage of time. Loretta wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't rushing through this. She paused on the final page where the last item was written: the brooch. Wedding gift. Estimated value: $14,000. Her fingers hovered above it, then slid to the side of the page where she had written a note to herself: insurance claim, pending. She smiled to herself. Kristen had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Her phone buzzed. She didn't have to look at it to know it was Amber. Her granddaughter had been texting since that morning, likely worried about her. Amber had always been the sensitive one, the one who'd never been able to stand the friction between Loretta and Kristen. It had gotten worse in recent years, but it was clear now that Amber knew exactly who the villain was in this story. She wasn't stupid, but she was also young, and Loretta wasn't about to drag her into this mess. Loretta unlocked her phone and read the message. "I'm staying out of it. but I love you." Loretta exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping a rhythm against the edge of the table. She typed a response. "You're not the target, sweetheart." "She is." A moment passed before Amber's reply came through. "I know. Be strong, Grandma." Loretta's smile was brief, fleeting. She was strong. She had to be. And this time, it wasn't about being a mother or grandmother anymore. It was about reclaiming what had always been hers, what had been taken and manipulated. Kristen was going to learn what it meant to cross the wrong line, to take advantage of someone who had given them everything. There was a knock on the door. Loretta's gaze flicked up. Pearl stood, phone still in hand, and nodded toward the door. "That's Nico. He's here." Loretta stood up, her knees stiff from sitting too long. Her fingers were still cold from the ledger, but the tension in her body was starting to shift, replaced by a sharpness that had been dormant for years. She walked to the door, and there was Nico, tall, neat in his real estate agent's suit, a slight frown of concern on his face as he stepped inside. "You need something, Loretta?" he asked, his voice professional, but she could tell by the way his eyes shifted that he knew this wasn't just about property. "Take a seat, Nico," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate. "It's time for us to talk about ownership." And just like that, Loretta's plan, years in the making, had begun its next step. Nico sat across from Loretta, his face serious, brows furrowed in professional concern, as he flipped through the legal documents Loretta had spread out in front of him. Pearl sat beside Loretta, arms crossed, a small grin playing at the corners of her mouth. She had already known this outcome, but watching Nico's realization unfold was almost as satisfying as seeing the deed itself. "Well, Loretta," Nico said, his voice clipped with the weight of the revelation, "it looks like Kristen never transferred title on the townhouse. Your name is still primary on the deed." Loretta's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of happiness. It was the smile of someone who knew they had just turned the tables. "I knew it," Loretta replied quietly. "She's been living there for years, pretending it was hers, and never bothered to make it official." Pearl raised an eyebrow. "Nothing like a little ownership to wake up a lazy daughter." Loretta didn't respond, her attention now fixed on Nico, who shuffled a few more papers before looking back at her. "You're still listed as the sole owner. If you wanted to, you could file for eviction. Clean. Legal. It's all here." Loretta's fingers danced over the page, tracing the words as if they were her victory. She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts whirring with the possibilities. She could take her time with this. There was no rush. Everything she had done up to this point was meticulous, planned. Each step was a calculated move in a game that Kristen had no idea she was even playing. "And the brooch?" Loretta asked, her voice suddenly tight, a slight edge to it. Nico paused, looking over a few more documents before nodding. "Still insured under your name, appraised at $14,000. It's covered. But it seems, well, you're still the rightful owner." Loretta leaned forward, her smile widening. "Good," she murmured, almost to herself. "I like having what's mine." She stood up slowly, as though she were considering the weight of her next move. Her hand hovered over the papers, her eyes flicking to Pearl, who was already reaching for her bag. "We should draft a repossession letter," Loretta said. "Loaned goods will do nicely, make it official." Pearl grinned and stood. "I'll get it started. We'll make sure Kristen knows that nothing's hers anymore." Loretta's eyes followed Pearl as she left the room, but her mind was elsewhere, already moving to the next step. She could feel the tension of the situation crackling in the air. This wasn't just about property. It wasn't just about the brooch. This was about control, power, respect. Everything that had been stripped away from her in that moment at the brunch. As Pearl disappeared upstairs to work on the letter, Loretta walked to the window, looking out over the yard. The Spanish moss waved in the breeze, the world outside still and quiet. But inside, her heart beat with an energy she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just Loretta Vaughn anymore, the soft-spoken, gentle mother. No, now she was the woman who had taken everything back, piece by piece. She looked down at her phone, the screen lighting up with a new notification. Kristen. A photo. She hesitated for a moment before clicking it open. Kristen stood in front of a mirror, grinning at the camera, the sapphire brooch shining against her blouse. Family heirlooms just hit different, Kristen had written as a caption, a smug, self-satisfied smile on her face. Loretta stared at the photo, her grip on the phone tightening. The arrogance, the defiance. Kristen was playing right into her hands without even realizing it. Loretta's fingers hovered over the screen, and in a moment of quiet fury, she composed a short message to Pearl. Send the repossession letter to her inbox and her mailbox. Let her see the legal papers. It's time to make her understand. Pearl's reply came quickly. Done. The letter's already on its way. Loretta's lips parted in a thin smile as she set the phone down on the table, her mind already shifting gears. The game was on, and Kristen had no idea how much she had already lost. The clock on the wall ticked, counting down the minutes as Loretta sank back into her chair. She could almost hear the gasp that would come when Kristen saw the letter. When she realized everything she had believed was hers wasn't. Everything that Loretta had built, every sacrifice made, would be reclaimed. And this time, there would be no going back. The doorbell rang, and Loretta straightened in her chair. It was the courier, the one who would be delivering the final blow. Her hand lingered near the ledger again, the one where every gift and loan was meticulously written. As she reached for it, her smile deepened. Kristen had taken the first shot. Now, Loretta was ready to take everything back. And she wasn't going to stop until every last thing was hers again. The sun hung low over Savannah, casting long shadows on the city streets as Loretta stepped out of her car, the engine purring to a stop. Pearl was already halfway to the courthouse door, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Loretta followed, her movements slow but deliberate, as if every step she took was another deliberate decision in her growing plan. Inside the county records office, the air smelled of dust and old paper, the weight of history in every crack of the floorboards. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their metal drawers filled with records of lives, of deeds, of legacies. Loretta moved past the rows of cabinets like someone who had always belonged here, like she had a rightful place among the dusty pages that held other people's futures. Pearl had already walked up to the counter, smiling at the clerk, her tone friendly but businesslike. Loretta could see the lines of this game forming in the woman's eyes. Pearl knew how to work the system, how to be charming and demanding all at once. Loretta approached, sliding the thick file onto the counter. She had been preparing this for weeks, a motion to reclaim everything, the townhouse, the car, the brooch, everything that had ever been given, lent, or simply taken. She wasn't asking for it back anymore. She was demanding it. The clerk looked up at the file, her fingers hesitant as she examined the documents, but there was no hesitation in Loretta. She was ready. She had all the receipts. She had all the proof. She had the weight of history behind her. I'd like to file this motion, Loretta said quietly, her voice smooth, but full of quiet command. Pearl stood at her side, watching the clerk carefully, her lips pursed, waiting. Certainly, ma'am, the clerk replied, though there was a slight hesitation in her voice. She started flipping through the forms, checking the dates and signatures. This is extensive. Loretta didn't smile. She didn't need to. I've waited long enough. The clerk made a note of it and then glanced at Pearl, who was already nudging the papers forward. I'll need to file these with the court. Loretta didn't wait for confirmation. Instead, she turned, walking past the filing cabinets toward the small corner of the office where a computer sat. Pearl followed her, leaning over as Loretta typed quickly, her fingers moving with precision. She listed everything in detail: real property, personal assets, the brooch, the car, the loaned goods that were, in fact, hers. Everything. And Kristen? Kristen was nowhere in the equation. "You're good at this," Pearl murmured, watching Loretta's focus. Loretta gave a soft laugh, one that carried no joy. "I learned from the best. My mother never gave anything without a paper trail." Pearl raised her glass of bourbon when they sat down in Loretta's living room later that evening, the papers filed, the legal weight now in motion. She slid the glass over to Loretta, who accepted it with a slight nod. The amber liquid swirled as Loretta raised it to her lips, the warmth spreading through her chest. Pearl took a slow sip, watching Loretta carefully. "Hell hath no fury like a mother with documentation," she said, a wry grin on her face. Loretta's lips twisted into a half-smile. "It's true, but this is something else entirely." The bourbon slid down smoothly, the sharpness of it a contrast to the quiet tension that hung in the room. Loretta set the glass down on the table, her mind already shifting again, already thinking of what came next. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away. It was Amber. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Loretta stared at the message for a moment before replying. "I'm fine, sweetheart. It's all in motion now." There was a brief pause before Amber's reply came through. "I know it's hard, but I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, you have me." Loretta felt a swell of something in her chest. Gratitude, maybe. But it was mixed with something else. Something darker. She'd never wanted to put Amber in the middle of this, but she'd known for years that this was where it was heading. It had always been a matter of when, not if, but there was still work to do. Loretta stood up, walking toward the safe in the corner of the room. She opened it with a smooth motion, the familiar combination clicking like it always had. Inside, the bank cards, account information, and various documents lay neatly organized. Her fingers brushed over the file marked Kristen, the one she'd kept hidden for years. And then, without hesitation, Loretta began the process. She revoked Kristen's access to her shared credit card, the last lifeline Kristen had to groceries, to living in the world outside of the wealth her mother had given her. Loretta changed the pins to the shared bank accounts, locking Kristen out of everything. She tucked the cards away, the final strands of connection severed in a cold, deliberate act. The house was quieter now. The clock ticked in the corner, the wind outside whispering through the trees. Loretta paused, her fingers lingering on the safe. She had taken back so much already. Her property, her dignity, and now, the last pieces of what Kristen had used to claim control. With a long exhale, Loretta stood, staring out the window. The road was quiet, the neighborhood peaceful. But inside, she could feel the storm building. Kristen was still unaware, still basking in her ill-gotten glory. But Loretta knew. The battle wasn't over yet. And when Kristen came crashing down, Loretta would be there to watch her fall. Loretta sat in her armchair, the house quiet around her. The same house she had once shared so many family moments in, the same house where her daughter had grown up. Now everything felt distant, almost hollow. The walls, once filled with the sounds of laughter, were now silent witnesses to the cold war that had erupted between them. Outside, the evening sky was turning purple, the last traces of daylight hanging over the trees like an unfinished painting. The wind was still, but Loretta could feel a shift in the air, something heavy that hadn't yet settled. Pearl entered the living room, her eyes sharp as she took in the atmosphere. There was no warmth left here, only a kind of anticipation that hung in the air, thick as fog. She walked to the kitchen counter where Loretta had left her phone charging, Pearl picked it up with deliberate care and switched it on, tapping a few buttons as she glanced toward Loretta. "Ready?" Pearl asked, her voice a mix of amusement and something darker, something that knew exactly what was about to happen. Loretta didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the door. She could feel it coming. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment Kristen would show up, demanding explanations, begging for forgiveness, or perhaps, just perhaps, trying to claim something that no longer belonged to her. Pearl set her phone to record. "Let's make sure we have the receipts," Pearl said, her voice calm but firm. Loretta gave a small nod. And then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a casual ring, but a sharp, insistent sound that echoed through the house. Loretta felt the tension crackle in the air. It was happening. Kristen had arrived. Loretta stood slowly, a measured movement that carried the weight of everything she had already endured. She walked toward the door, her shoes clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that almost sounded like a countdown. When she opened the door, Kristen was standing there, her posture stiff with anger, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Her eyes were wide, but it wasn't shock. It was rage. "You humiliated me in front of everyone," Kristen spat, her voice like a whip cracking through the air. Her lips trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was pure, unfiltered fury. She stepped forward, almost as though she intended to force her way inside, her eyes daring Loretta to stop her. Loretta didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle. She simply stood there, calm, collected, watching her daughter with the kind of stillness that made Kristen's rage look small and childish by comparison. "No," Loretta said quietly, her voice controlled, her eyes unblinking. "You did." Kristen's mouth snapped shut, her anger briefly faltering as the words landed. But it was only a moment before she took a step forward, her expression twisted in disbelief. She was about to force her way inside, to demand answers, to take back control the way she always had. Loretta's hand shot out, blocking the doorframe, her body a silent barrier between Kristen and the house she had once called her own. "Don't," Loretta said, her voice cold now, every word a steel-tipped command. Kristen's eyes widened, the heat in them flashing for a moment before the rage exploded again. "You can't stop me. This is my—" "No," Pearl interrupted, her voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "One step over that threshold, and this becomes criminal trespass." Kristen paused, her breath quickening as she processed the words. But before she could say anything else, the mask slipped. "You're sick in the head," Kristen shouted, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and something else. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. But she wasn't ready to admit it. Loretta stood silent, unyielding in the doorway, a figure of immovable strength. She felt a cold, satisfied smirk tug at the corners of her lips. She wasn't afraid of her daughter anymore. Not the way she had been. Not after all the years of being used, of giving so much while receiving so little. "I'm not the one who's sick, Kristen," Loretta said, her voice now a quiet storm. "I'm the one who's been giving. And you? You're the one who took." Kristen's face twisted, and for a moment Loretta saw something behind the anger, a flicker of doubt, of realization that maybe, just maybe, she had pushed her mother too far. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by defiance. She stepped back, raising her chin. "This isn't over," she said, though the words lacked their usual bite. They hung in the air between them like a question rather than a threat. Loretta didn't respond. She simply stepped back into the house and closed the door, the finality of it ringing in the silence that followed. The click of the lock sounded louder than anything had in a long time. Inside, Loretta felt a strange calm wash over her, the kind that comes after a storm. She knew it wasn't over. Not yet. There was still more to come. But for now, she had the upper hand. She glanced toward Pearl, who was already putting her phone down. "You got everything?" Pearl nodded. "Every word. Every step." She smiled, a cold, knowing grin. Kristen won't be able to pretend she's the victim anymore. Loretta turned toward the window, staring out at the quiet street. The world outside was still, but inside she could feel the next phase of the plan settling into place. Kristen's game was about to come to a crashing halt. And when it did, Loretta would be there, watching, ready. The storm was building, and this time, Loretta wasn't going to be the one caught in the middle. She was going to make sure her daughter understood. Nothing was hers anymore. The clock in the living room ticked softly, its rhythm steady and unyielding, like the quiet buildup of a storm that Loretta could feel pressing in on her. It was only a matter of time before Kristen came knocking again, demanding something that didn't belong to her. But Loretta had already anticipated this moment, had prepared for it in a way her daughter never could. Loretta sat at her kitchen table, a folder of legal papers spread out before her. The weight of the documents was a silent promise. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling only slightly as she dialed the number she knew by heart. "Marla Green." The voice on the other end answered, smooth and professional. Loretta could practically hear the smile in her lawyer's voice, a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. "It's Loretta Vaughn. We need to move forward with the cease and desist," Loretta said, her voice low, every word deliberate. "Kristen's been interfering with my property. She's been harassing me, and it needs to stop. Now." Marla paused, the line crackling for a moment before she spoke. "Of course, Loretta. We'll draft the letter and send it immediately. I'll also start proceedings for the townhouse eviction. It's been clear for a while that she never signed a lease, and given that the property is still in your name, well, let's just say we have the upper hand." Loretta let out a small breath, a tension she hadn't realized she was holding easing out of her. "Good. Do whatever needs to be done. We've been patient long enough." Marla's tone shifted, more businesslike now. "I'll also take care of revoking the power of attorney Kristen was given. You can't have someone like that running things for you anymore." Loretta's lips curved into a thin, satisfied smile. "No, I can't." She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, the silence stretching out around her like a cocoon, wrapping her in its quiet confidence. Every move she made had led her to this moment. The battle wasn't just about possessions anymore, it was about control. The control that had been stripped away, piece by piece, and was now being taken back, by force, if necessary. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Amber. "Mom's saying you've lost it. I know the truth." Loretta stared at the message, her heart tightening for a moment. Amber. Her granddaughter. The only one who had ever seemed to understand. She knew what had been going on, what Kristen had done, but she also knew Amber wasn't ready to fully take sides. Not yet. Loretta's fingers hovered over the screen. The words were simple, but they carried a weight. Amber was afraid. Afraid of what this would mean for the family. Loretta pressed the screen, her thumb slow but steady. "So does the county." She hit send, the finality of it almost comforting. The county knew. The paperwork was already in motion. Kristen had no idea what was coming for her. The front door creaked open, breaking the stillness of the house. Loretta glanced up to see Pearl stepping inside, a glass of bourbon in hand. She raised an eyebrow at the phone in Loretta's hand, the text still displayed on the screen. "Everything set?" Pearl asked, her voice soft but with an edge to it. Loretta nodded, slipping the phone into her pocket. "Everything is in motion. Kristen will find out soon enough." Pearl walked over to the kitchen table, her heels clicking against the floor. She set the glass down, her gaze scanning the pile of legal papers. "I've seen you prepare for a lot of things, Loretta. But this is different. You're really doing it. Loretta met her friend's gaze, her eyes steady. It's time. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the words hanging between them. Pearl didn't need to say anything more. She understood. She had seen this side of Loretta before, the quiet strength, the calm after a storm. And now, the storm was rising again. But this time, Loretta wasn't the one caught in its path. She was the one making it happen. Suddenly, Loretta's phone buzzed again. Amber's reply was quick. I'm worried about you. Please don't lose yourself in this. Loretta's heart twisted for a moment, the tightness in her chest threatening to crush her resolve. She had never wanted Amber to be caught in the crossfire, but this wasn't about her, and it wasn't about Kristen. This was about Loretta, the woman who had given everything for her family, and who had finally decided to take back what was hers. Loretta's fingers hovered over her phone again, but this time she didn't respond. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and stood up, walking to the window. The street outside was quiet, peaceful, the calm before the storm. But Loretta knew it wouldn't last. Kristen had pushed too far, and now it was Loretta's turn to push back. She wasn't just going to reclaim what was taken from her. She was going to make sure Kristen never took anything again. The battle lines were drawn. The papers were filed. And there was no turning back now. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Loretta's living room, casting a golden haze over the papers strewn across the table. She stood over the printer, her fingers working mechanically to print the latest page of the evidence packet, the one that would make Kristen's arrogance a matter of public record. The post Kristen had so smugly shared online, flaunting the brooch, now had its place in a legal case that was gaining momentum with every passing minute. Loretta stood, letting the printer hum softly behind her. She took the printed page and, without a moment's hesitation, added it to the growing stack of documentation. Her lawyer, Marla Green, had been a blessing in this mess. Every piece of evidence, every exchange, was now catalogued, cross-referenced, and prepared to be presented in court. Kristen wouldn't be able to run from this. Pearl entered the room just as Loretta was arranging the papers. She looked over at the stack with a raised brow. "Ready to deliver the notice?" Pearl asked, her voice filled with a knowing calm. Loretta nodded, her eyes narrowing as she slid the file into a manila envelope. It's time. They moved through the house, the sounds of their footsteps muffled against the carpet. Pearl held the envelope with the official notice to vacate Kristen's townhouse, the final act that would shake Kristen's foundations. Loretta wasn't done yet, but she knew this would be the first blow that couldn't be undone. The drive to the townhouse was quiet, the engine of Pearl's car humming steadily as they made their way through Savannah's streets. Loretta sat in the passenger seat, her eyes focused on the passing landscape, a city she had known her entire life, but one that felt increasingly distant. When they arrived, Pearl wasted no time. She marched up the front steps of Kristen's townhouse, envelope in hand, and knocked firmly on the door. Loretta stood back, watching from the car as Kristen appeared in the window. A shadow first, then the unmistakable figure of her daughter, standing behind the glass with a look of disbelief etched across her face. Loretta felt a pang of something. Was it sadness? Regret? No. It was a reminder that this was what needed to happen. The woman who had once been so full of promise, so full of hope, had turned into someone who thought she could take whatever she wanted no matter the cost. And now it was time for her to face the consequences of that belief. Pearl handed the notice to Kristen, who took it with a hand that trembled slightly. As Pearl turned to leave, Kristen didn't even open it. Instead, she crumpled the notice into a ball and tossed it out onto the lawn. The action was dramatic, defiant, as though the act itself could erase the reality of what was happening. Pearl took out her phone and hit record. Kristen's face was flushed with rage, her lips curled into a sneer as she watched the paper flutter on the grass. "This is all a joke. I'm not going anywhere." Loretta watched it all unfold from the car, the scene playing out like a twisted version of everything she had imagined. The anger, the defensiveness. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. Kristen was playing right into her hands, each move she made only tightening the noose Loretta had slowly but surely prepared. Pearl ended the recording, slipping her phone back into her purse. She turned to Loretta as she returned to the car. "Two birds, one courtroom," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting in a sly grin. Loretta nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the finality of the action. She wasn't finished yet, though. This was only the beginning. Once they returned to Loretta's house, Pearl handed over the legal forms for the brooch, ready to file for small claims. Loretta ran her fingers over the documents, her heart steady in its rhythm. Kristen had taken something she couldn't fully understand, something that Loretta had worn on her wedding day, a token of love and memory, and Loretta would make sure she got it back. "You've done it," Pearl remarked, watching her with a quiet admiration as Loretta filled out the necessary forms. Loretta smiled thinly. "Not yet. I still need to make a few more changes." She picked up her pen, her hand steady, as she went over the details of the final will. The one change that had been building for years, the one thing that would remove Kristen from her life completely. Loretta's fingers hesitated over the page, but only for a moment. There was no going back from this. The ink on the paper would sever the last thread of connection. "Kristen doesn't deserve a place in my will," Loretta said quietly, the words so final that Pearl didn't need to ask any further questions. Pearl understood. Loretta signed the document with a slow, deliberate motion, and as the pen left the paper, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense of calm that only came from knowing you had taken back what was yours. The house felt quieter now, the air still with a heavy sense of satisfaction. Loretta sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the street outside. The storm was no longer a distant rumble. It was here. And when it broke, Loretta would be ready. She wasn't just reclaiming what was hers, she was making sure that nothing Kristen had could ever be taken for granted again. The final pieces were in place, and there would be no turning back. Loretta sat at the kitchen table, the last few days a blur of legal wrangling, paperwork, and quiet satisfaction. The house was emptier now, quieter, but the calm was only temporary. The storm had broken, and the consequences were still waiting to unfold. Her phone buzzed again, the familiar notification tone jolting her from her thoughts. It was Amber. Loretta let it ring twice before answering, but she could feel the tension already creeping up her spine. "Grandma." Amber's voice was hesitant, soft but laced with worry. "Mom's saying you're destroying the family." Loretta's grip tightened on the phone, the edges of her vision blurring momentarily with a wave of frustration. She exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to snap, to let her anger overtake her. But she couldn't. Not yet. "She destroyed the family when she weaponized my age," Loretta replied, her voice low, steady. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. "When she used me, used my love, my sacrifice, for her own gain. That's when she destroyed it. Not me." Amber didn't respond right away, and Loretta could almost hear the wheels turning on the other end. She wasn't sure what Amber wanted from her. Maybe some reassurance, some confirmation that everything would be okay. But Loretta had no more room for reassurance. She had given too much for too long. "I don't want to pick sides, Grandma," Amber said finally, her voice trembling. "But I know who the abuser is." Loretta closed her eyes, the words cutting through her like a knife. She had always tried to protect Amber from the worst of it, but the truth was too clear now. Amber wasn't blind. She knew what had been happening all along. Loretta leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table. "You don't have to pick sides, sweetheart," she said, her voice almost soft enough to be a comfort. "But you do have to choose truth." There was a long pause, and then Amber spoke again, quieter now. "I'm scared, Grandma. I don't want to lose you, too." Loretta's heart tightened, but she pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about Amber finding her own path, her own strength. "You won't lose me," Loretta said firmly. "I'll always be here for you. But I need you to understand this. You don't owe your mother anything. Not after everything she's done." Loretta could almost feel Amber's reluctance, her hesitancy to let go of the last remaining ties to the family she had known. But it wasn't Amber's fault. She hadn't been raised to understand the depths of manipulation Kristen had inflicted. "I'm sorry," Amber whispered. Loretta's gaze flickered over to the hallway, her mind already shifting to the next thing, the next step. "I know you are, sweetie. But it's time. You have to let me handle this now. I'm the one who raised her, and I'm the one who has to end it." Amber didn't respond immediately. The silence was heavy, stretching out between them as they both struggled with the weight of what needed to happen next. Loretta stood up and walked over to the counter, reaching for the small brass key she had kept hidden in the drawer. She hadn't given it to anyone in years, not since the days when she thought there was still room for trust in her family. "This," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "is the last key to this house. Not everyone gets one of these anymore." Loretta slid the key into Amber's hand, her fingers brushing against her granddaughter's skin. The contact was brief, but it was a moment of unspoken understanding. Of trust, maybe. But more than that, a passing of the baton. The house, the home, was now Amber's responsibility, but the rest of it, the legacy, the blood, the cruelty, it was Loretta's to deal with. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Loretta added. "But you'll understand one day. I hope." Amber's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she didn't cry. She didn't speak either. She simply nodded, turning the key in her hand before slipping it into her pocket. Loretta watched her for a moment, the weight of the exchange settling in her chest. It was the right thing, but it didn't feel like it. Not yet. The phone buzzed again, interrupting the moment. This time, it was a message from Marla. Loretta didn't even have to read it. She could tell by the tone. The small claims hearing was scheduled. The brooch was going back where it belonged. But Kristen wouldn't give up easily. Loretta knew that. She'd fought too long to be defeated now, and she wasn't going to let it go without making sure her daughter understood that nothing she'd taken would ever be hers again. She walked back to the living room, her steps slow but determined. Pearl was already sitting on the couch, waiting. Kristen had made her move. Now it was Loretta's turn. Pearl looked up at her, knowing without asking. "It's done then?" Loretta nodded. "It's done." And in the silence that followed, Loretta allowed herself a moment of peace, because the battle wasn't over yet, but it was already turning in her favor. The courtroom was cold, its walls draped in muted tones of gray and beige that seemed to suck the energy from the room. Loretta walked in, her heels clicking firmly against the linoleum floor, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady ahead. She wasn't nervous, not like she had been years ago. That woman, the one who trembled at the thought of conflict, of standing up to her own flesh and blood, was gone. The woman before them now was a force. A storm waiting to break, armed with nothing but the truth and the paperwork to back it up. Kristen was already seated at the defendant's table, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as though she expected the walls themselves to turn on her. Her once perfect appearance was disheveled, her lipstick slightly smeared, and her hands were shaking beneath the table. Loretta didn't pity her. Not after everything she had done. As Loretta walked toward the bench, she saw Kristen flinch. It was the smallest movement, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Loretta saw it. Kristen was afraid. Not of the law, not of the judge, but of what Loretta was about to do. The judge entered the room with a sharp, authoritative air, his robe sweeping around him as he took his seat. He barely looked at Kristen before his gaze turned to Loretta. A small nod acknowledging her presence. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, his voice calm yet piercing. "We are here today to discuss the matter of the eviction and the return of personal property." Loretta nodded, standing tall, her hands clasped firmly in front of her. The weight of the case, of everything she had worked for, felt almost light now. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for every move Kristen might try. And she wasn't about to let her daughter lie her way out of this. Kristen stood when the judge addressed her. "Your Honor, this is absurd," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "She's my mother. She's old. She's confused. She doesn't know what she's doing." Loretta's eyes narrowed as Kristen's words floated through the air. It was the same play Kristen had always used. Manipulation. The same victim complex. The same feigned helplessness that had gotten her everything she wanted for so long. Loretta had no intention of letting it work this time. The judge didn't look moved. He glanced at his notes, then back at Kristen. "Ma'am, this case is quite different from what you're describing. We have extensive documentation here." He turned to Loretta, who stepped forward and placed the stack of evidence in front of him. Receipts, property deeds, insurance statements, text logs, and the video of Kristen tossing the eviction notice onto the lawn. All meticulously organized, each piece a testament to the years of exploitation Loretta had endured. The judge flipped through the papers, his expression growing more serious with each page. Kristen's face flushed red, her lips tight, but she didn't speak. She knew there was nothing she could say to erase the evidence Loretta had carefully compiled. After a moment, the judge looked up, his frown deepening. "Ma'am, this is extensive." He glanced at Kristen, who opened her mouth to protest, but the judge held up his hand, silencing her. "This isn't about drama or confusion," Loretta interjected, her voice steady, clear. "This is about boundaries. Boundaries I have spent my life building, and boundaries that my daughter has spent years trampling on." Kristen's face twisted in disbelief. "She's making drama. This is all some big—" Loretta cut her off. "I'm not making drama. I'm making boundaries." She turned back to the judge. "I gave her everything. I gave her my love, my support, my money. And this is how she repays me, by throwing away everything that mattered." The judge, clearly no stranger to family drama, set down the papers and adjusted his glasses. His gaze turned to Kristen once more, his expression unyielding. "The court will rule in favor of the plaintiff, Loretta Vaughn," he announced. "Kristen Vaughn is to vacate the townhouse immediately, and all personal property that was loaned, specifically the brooch, is to be returned to Loretta Vaughn. This case is settled." Kristen's face turned a shade of crimson Loretta had never seen before. The shock was almost palpable. But it wasn't just anger. It was panic. She had underestimated her mother. She had underestimated Loretta's resolve, thinking that age would make her weak. But Loretta had proven that strength wasn't measured by years. It was measured by the resolve to take back what was hers. Kristen's voice, now trembling with desperation, barely rose above a whisper. "You can't do this. You can't just take everything from me." Loretta's heart didn't soften. It had hardened long ago, not by the passage of time, but by the betrayal of her own flesh and blood. She leaned in, her gaze never leaving her daughter. "I didn't take anything from you, Kristen. I'm just taking back what you stole." Kristen stood frozen, her face pale, her hands at her sides, defeated in a way Loretta had never imagined her to be. The once proud woman, who had manipulated her way through life, was now exposed for the world to see. Loretta wasn't the one who had destroyed the family. Kristen had done that herself. As the judge banged his gavel, Loretta stood taller than she ever had before. She had won. But more than that, she had taken back her dignity, her power, and her legacy. And she wasn't done yet. As she walked out of the courtroom, Pearl by her side, Loretta felt something shift deep inside her. The final piece had fallen into place. Kristen had played her hand. Now Loretta was holding the winning card. The storm was over. And Loretta had come out unscathed. The courthouse doors had barely closed behind Loretta before the first notification popped up on her phone. It wasn't the usual news or a family message. It was a TikTok video, and it was Kristen's face staring back at her, distorted by rage, her voice shaking as she shouted at the camera, her words barely intelligible through the fury. "She stole everything from me!" Kristen screeched, her makeup streaked with tears. The angle of the video was skewed, the camera jerking with every frantic movement she made. "She's an old witch, a monster. I'm her daughter. She can't just take it all away." The rest of the video was a blur of sobs, screams, and broken words, as Kristen slammed her fists against the courthouse steps in a dramatic fit. And then, as if on cue, the camera zoomed out to reveal the crowd behind her. The curious onlookers who had watched the scene unfold now had their phones raised, recording, capturing every moment for the world to see. Loretta didn't need to watch the rest. She already knew what would happen. The hashtag #ChuChalk_receipts_win was already trending. She sighed deeply and set the phone down on the kitchen counter, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Pearl, who had been sitting at the table, watching with a sly grin, didn't need to say a word. "I assume the world's already seen it," Loretta muttered, her voice thick with disdain. But there was a flicker of something else, something close to satisfaction, in her eyes. "World's got a front row seat to the drama now," Pearl said, her tone light. But there was no denying the satisfaction in her voice. "Looks like Kristen's losing more than the townhouse." Loretta's lips twitched into a grim smile. "She's lost everything," she replied softly, "including her dignity." Pearl raised an eyebrow, then leaned back in her chair. "She's given you enough material, Loretta. I'd say the case is closed." Loretta nodded, but there was still something in her chest that burned, something not quite finished. She wasn't about to let Kristen play the victim anymore. Not now. Not ever. The next day, Loretta's lawyer, Marla, had sent over another batch of paperwork. A second notice this time. A formal lien on all the gifted property Kristen had never legally transferred. The townhouse, the car, the furniture, the jewelry. Loretta had watched Kristen's life build itself on everything she'd given her. But now, she was taking it all back. "It's time," Loretta muttered, as she signed the document with a sharp, deliberate motion. The ink on the paper was a final declaration. Kristen would learn what it meant to take more than she had earned. As she put the pen down, Loretta's phone buzzed again. It was Amber. Her message read, "I can't believe she said that. About you." Loretta's smile faltered for a moment. She read the words again, the hurt in Amber's voice clear even through the screen. It was a reminder of how deep the wounds ran, how torn Amber had been throughout this entire ordeal. Loretta had been prepared for Kristen's bitterness, but seeing her granddaughter caught in the middle still stung. "She's been saying it for years," Loretta replied, her fingers quick on the keyboard. She just finally used her outside voice. There was a long pause before Amber responded. "I don't know how you keep doing this, Grandma. I really don't." Loretta's heart softened at her granddaughter's words, but she kept her resolve firm. "Because I have to. You'll understand one day, Amber. When it's your turn to protect what's yours, you'll know why I did it." The phone went silent again, but Loretta could feel the weight of the conversation lingering. Pearl leaned in, her voice low and teasing. "Want to pawn the brooch?" Loretta looked at her, then at the sparkling piece of jewelry nestled inside the small velvet box. The brooch that had once been a symbol of love and sacrifice. Her something blue on her wedding day, now reclaimed by a mother who had given up everything for the wrong reasons. It was worth more than any amount of money. "No," Loretta said, her voice steady, unshaken. "I'll wear it at the next wedding, hers or not." Pearl chuckled, a knowing smirk crossing her face as she raised her glass of bourbon. "Well, you sure know how to make a statement." Loretta's lips curled upward at the edges as she reached for her own glass, the amber liquid swirling around inside. It wasn't about the brooch. It wasn't even about the house. It was about something bigger. Loretta had fought for her dignity, for the truth. And now, she was watching it all unfold. It felt right. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the Spanish moss hanging from the trees. The world beyond the window was still, peaceful. But inside, there was a quiet strength, a feeling of victory, even as the storm raged on in the hearts of those who had wronged her. Kristen's tantrum had been nothing more than a final desperate cry. The world had seen it, the court had ruled, and Loretta had taken back what was hers. She had won. And the game wasn't over yet. The card was too clean, too perfect. The edges still sharp. The gold lettering that once read, with deepest sympathy, was nothing more than a cruel reminder of the years Loretta had spent trying to salvage a relationship with her daughter. The sympathy was always for Kristen, never for Loretta, who had been left in the shadows of a family that had long ago turned its back on her. Loretta sat at the kitchen table, her hands steady as she took the card from the envelope. It had arrived just 2 days ago, nestled among the pile of bills and legal notices. It was a half-hearted attempt at reconciliation, a last-ditch effort from Kristen to smooth things over after the court hearing, probably penned by a lawyer disguised in the guise of an apology, a hollow attempt at control. She tore it in half. The paper ripped cleanly, the sound too satisfying. Each tear was a final note in the symphony of her breaking ties with the daughter she once fought so hard to protect. The torn pieces of the card lay on the table, each one a symbol of what could have been, what might have been, but not anymore. Loretta stuffed them back into the envelope, its edges crinkling under the pressure, and sealed it shut. She walked to the front door, opened it, and set the envelope on the porch, the wind catching it slightly before it settled against the welcome mat. There would be no second chances. Not this time. As she stepped back inside, she moved with the purposeful grace of someone who had walked away from an entire lifetime, a weight now gone. The phone rang. Loretta didn't flinch. She knew who it was before she even glanced at the screen. Her voicemail greeting had been changed a day before. "If you're calling to reconcile, speak to my attorney." Loretta's voice was steady, calm, the words perfectly neutral, without a hint of emotion. She wasn't angry anymore. That part was done. She went to the kitchen and poured herself a drink. Bourbon, smooth and familiar. As the amber liquid filled the glass, she thought back on the years she had spent giving, until she had nothing left. The front door creaked. Loretta turned, expecting someone she wasn't ready for, but it was Amber. She stood in the doorway, hesitant at first, as if unsure whether to enter, and then with a soft sigh, walked in. "I thought it'd just be the two of us tonight," Loretta said, her voice softer now. There was a familiarity in the way she spoke to Amber, a comfort in the stillness between them. Amber nodded, closing the door behind her. "I didn't want to leave you alone tonight," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. Loretta gave her a tight smile as she motioned to the table. gesturing for Amber to sit down. "It's been a long day, a long few weeks." She poured Amber a drink, not bourbon, but something gentler, more fitting for the quieter evening they would share. Amber sat, staring at the glass for a moment before meeting her grandmother's gaze. "I don't really know what to say," she murmured. I don't understand why, Mom." Her voice faltered and she stopped herself, as if the words were too heavy to bear. Loretta took a deep breath. She didn't want to get lost in the past, in the hurt that had been passed down like a cursed heirloom. "You don't have to understand. You just have to keep moving forward." A silence lingered between them, thick and warm, as the weight of the world seemed to hang in the air. Amber's eyes glistened, though she didn't shed a tear. She was stronger than that. "You've been through a lot, Grandma," Amber whispered, her voice cracking for the briefest of moments. "I can't even imagine." Loretta's hand, steady as ever, reached for the small wooden box beside her, opening it with careful hands. Inside was a simple locket, a silver heart, worn by years but still glinting softly in the dim light. She handed it to Amber, her fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary. Amber took it in her hands, turning it over and over. "I know it's not much," Loretta said, her voice a quiet murmur. "But it's yours now." Amber looked up at her, surprised. "Grandma, it's beautiful." Loretta nodded slowly. "It's simple, but it's earned. That's what matters." Amber's breath hitched, and for the first time in days, tears welled in her eyes. "I'll protect it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Like it's alive." Loretta reached over, taking Amber's hand in hers, the grip firm and unwavering. "It is," she said. "It's what legacy looks like, after the rot's been cut out." There was a moment of peace between them, the kind that only comes after a storm has passed. Amber clutched the locket to her chest, her expression one of quiet understanding. She had seen the battle. She had watched it unfold. And she knew, just as Loretta did, that this was the beginning of something new. Loretta stood slowly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She looked out the window, the soft glow of evening settling over the neighborhood. The battle was over, but the healing was just beginning. Amber's voice broke the silence. "What now, Grandma?" Loretta smiled softly, a new kind of resolve settling over her. Now we move forward." And for the first time in a long time, Loretta felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The phone call came in the early hours, the kind that pulls you from a deep sleep and forces you to confront the weight of the day ahead. Loretta didn't hesitate. Her hand moved instinctively toward the phone, fingers tapping the screen to answer. "Loretta, it's Marla." The lawyer's voice came through, smooth and professional. "Kristen's challenge has been filed, but we've already moved. I've submitted the emergency injunction. Her claim is officially blocked." Loretta exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The storm that had been brewing for so long was finally beginning to quiet. "Good," she murmured, her fingers tapping the armrest of her chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Get it done, Marla." "I'm on it," came the reply, and the line went dead. Loretta stood from her chair, the leather creaking under her weight, and moved toward the window. She could see the faint glow of the streetlights outside, casting long shadows across the yard. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. Savannah was a city of quiet strength, just like her. But there was still work to do. There always was. Later that day, Loretta stood outside the townhouse, a final decision made. She had found a buyer. A quiet, discreet transaction, fast and cash only. No questions asked. It was the only way to ensure that Kristen couldn't come back, that the house would be completely out of her grasp. It had been Loretta's home for too long, and now it would be someone else's. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and delivered in a matter of hours. The proceeds? They were already in a new trust. A trust for Amber. Loretta had always known what was important, what she could still give. Kristen had made her choice long ago. Amber? Amber was the future, the last thread of something that still mattered. Loretta sat back in the armchair, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had spent years giving, years pouring herself into someone who never understood the value of what she was offering. But Amber? Amber was different. Amber understood sacrifice, and she understood strength. Loretta had spent so much of her life feeling unseen, unheard. But she would make sure Amber never had to feel that way. Kristen didn't understand what Loretta had built, but Amber would. A few days later, the formal notice arrived for Kristen, a reminder of what she had lost and what Loretta had taken back. The house was no longer hers, and with the 72-hour vacate notice firmly in place, it was only a matter of time before Kristen was forced to leave. The letter sat on the table, its finality sharp against the soft hum of the house. Loretta folded it carefully, placing it into an envelope. The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Kristen had pushed everything too far, and now there was no going back. Later, Loretta stood in front of the old oak cabinet where the brooch was kept. The sapphire gleamed in the dim light of the living room. She carefully removed it from its velvet case, holding it in her hands for the first time in years. It had always been meant for a moment like this, when the storm had passed, and she could wear it proudly, without fear. She fastened it to her blouse, the cool metal a reminder of her strength. Her own victory, her own reclamation. Pearl entered the room just as Loretta stood back to admire herself in the mirror. Pearl's eyes flicked to the brooch, and her smile grew. "Not bad," Pearl said, her tone light but knowing. "You didn't just win, you sealed it." Loretta turned toward her friend, the weight of the moment settling over her like a soft mantle. "It's done," she replied simply, though the words carried an entire lifetime of meaning. Pearl raised her glass of bourbon, a silent toast in the quiet of the room. Loretta joined her, the smooth amber liquid warming her throat as she took a sip. The brooch sparkled on her blouse, a shining emblem of everything she had fought for, everything she had taken back. For the first time in years, Loretta felt truly at peace. The storm had broken, and the world, once chaotic, was finally still. The next chapter had begun, and this time Loretta was the one in control. She wasn't just reclaiming her past, she was building a future for herself, and a future for Amber. The battle was over, but the legacy was just beginning. Amber sat across from Loretta at the kitchen table, her phone held tightly in her hands, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. The text message had come in just minutes ago, its words still fresh, still raw. Amber hadn't said a word yet, but Loretta could see the hesitation in her eyes, the uncertainty that lingered between them. It was a message from Kristen, a final attempt perhaps, to manipulate Amber back into her corner, to pull her into the maelstrom she'd created. Loretta had prepared herself for it, had known it would come eventually. Kristen wasn't one to go quietly into the night. But the message Amber was holding in her hand was different. It was desperate. And it was the last move in a game Loretta was done playing. Amber finally broke the silence, her voice tight but clear. "She's asking me to side with her. She says you've gone too far. That you're destroying the family. She says you're not thinking straight anymore." Loretta leaned back in her chair, the weight of those words settling on her chest. Her heart didn't flinch at the mention of Kristen. She had come to terms with her daughter's cruelty long ago, but hearing Amber repeat them, knowing her granddaughter was caught between the two of them, stung more than Loretta cared to admit. "You don't have to pick sides, sweetheart," Loretta said, her voice quiet but firm. You just have to pick truth. Amber looked down at her phone again, as though trying to make sense of it all, her fingers lingering on the screen. But then, she did something that Loretta hadn't expected. She set the phone down, her face softening as she looked Loretta directly in the eyes. Then I pick you, Amber said, her voice unwavering now. You're the one who's been there for me. You're the one who's always had my back, even when I didn't know what was going on. Loretta's heart swelled at Amber's words, but there was no time for sentimentality. She reached over and took Amber's hand, squeezing it gently. You made the right choice, she said, her voice steady, as though this moment had been inevitable. The only choice. The weight of the decision was over now. Amber had chosen truth, had chosen her grandmother. And Loretta, in turn, made a choice of her own. The years of being manipulated, of being stripped of her voice, had come to an end. She would protect what was hers, and she would protect Amber from the same fate. This wasn't just about Kristen. It was about ensuring Amber would never be in the same position, never have to fight for herself the way Loretta had. Loretta stood, moving toward her desk where the documents were stacked neatly. The trust. The legal paperwork. Amber's future. Secured. She picked up the pen, the sharp tip gliding over the page with ease. The words were simple, but the meaning was profound. She updated her trust, formally naming Amber as the successor trustee. Kristen would be legally cut off, her name erased from any future inheritance, even through Amber. It was a clean break, one that Loretta had long been considering. But now, the time had come. The decision was final. Loretta took a deep breath as she set the pen down. She wasn't finished yet. There was one final step. She walked over to the final court order, the one that had been handed down in Kristen's eviction case, the one that had solidified Loretta's control. She carefully lifted the paper from the frame, her fingers smoothing out the wrinkles. Then, in the quiet of the room, she took the pen and wrote a single word at the bottom of the page, just beneath the judge's signature. Mine. The ink was still wet as Loretta stepped back, looking at the words that now defined the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had claimed her dignity. She had claimed her future. And now, she had claimed her right to peace. Turning back to Amber, Loretta smiled softly. This is where we start again, she said. This time, it's different. This time, we're in control. Amber's eyes glistened, and for the first time in a long while, Loretta felt the weight of everything that had come before them begin to lift. The house, the inheritance, the brooch, it was all part of the past. But this was their future, and it was in their hands now. As Loretta walked back toward the window, she saw the world outside, still, peaceful, and calm. Savannah, as always, stood quiet, wrapped in the evening light. The battle had been long, the storm had raged, but now there was only peace, and Loretta knew, as she stood with Amber at her side, that she had won. The sun was setting over Savannah, casting long golden shadows over the house Loretta had spent years building, both physically and emotionally. The house, once a place of chaos and disappointment, now stood as a symbol of her triumph. It had been years since she'd felt truly at home in it, years of giving and expecting nothing in return, but now, the foundation of that house had shifted. Loretta was back in control, and the house, like everything else in her life, was hers to reclaim. Outside, she knelt in the soft earth, the rich smell of soil filling her lungs as she dug the small holes for the lavender plants. They were simple plants, nothing grand, but they symbolized the peace she was finally cultivating after so many storms. One by one, she gently placed the lavender into the ground, her fingers brushing the delicate stems as she set them in place. As she finished planting, she looked up to see Pearl standing at the door, a mischievous smile on her face. In her hands, she held a small iron sign. Loretta stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands and walking toward her. "I figured you'd like something for the front porch," Pearl said, grinning as she handed Loretta the sign. Loretta laughed softly, taking it from her. The words on the sign were simple, clear. No trespassing, no exceptions. She held it up and stepped back, imagining how it would look on the front gate. A fitting warning for anyone who dared to step onto her property. Loretta attached the sign to the gate with a single firm motion, the metal glinting in the fading sunlight. "You always know just what I need," Loretta said, giving Pearl a knowing smile. Pearl raised an eyebrow and laughed. "Well, don't get too comfortable yet. I have something else for you." She handed Loretta a welcome mat. The words printed on it made Loretta's lips curl into a half smile. "Witch lives here, and pays her own damn bills." It was a joke, but it was also the truth. Loretta had earned everything she had. She wasn't some passive bystander in her own life anymore. She had fought, clawed, and taken back what was hers. And now, no one would ever take it from her again. "That's perfect," Loretta said, her voice a mix of amusement and pride. She placed the mat at the foot of the door and stood back to admire it. The house felt right now. It felt like it had been waiting for her to return to it, for her to reclaim her space, her life. It was quiet, peaceful, the way it had always been meant to be. But as she turned back toward Pearl, she saw Amber walking down the street, her face a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. In her hands, she held a pie, the smell of apples and cinnamon drifting in the air behind her. "Grandma, I've got news," Amber said as she reached the front steps, her voice filled with energy. "But first, I thought I'd bring over a little something." Loretta smiled warmly and moved to take the pie from Amber's hands. "What's the news, sweetheart?" she asked as they stepped inside. Amber followed her into the kitchen, setting the pie down on the counter. "I've been accepted to college," she said, her voice wavering between joy and disbelief. "I'm going to make it. I'm really going." Loretta's heart swelled with pride. She had always known Amber would go far. Her granddaughter had been through so much, seen so much, and yet she was still standing, still pushing forward. Loretta placed a hand on Amber's shoulder and smiled, her heart full. "Looks like we're both going places," Loretta said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The realization hit her then. This wasn't just about what she had taken back from Kristen. It was about the future, about Amber. Loretta had given up so much for so long, but now it was time to pass that strength on. It was time for Amber to inherit not just the house or the money, but the lessons, the resilience, and the unshakable will to survive. Amber smiled back at her, her eyes bright with the excitement of what lay ahead. "You don't know how much this means to me, Grandma." Loretta squeezed her shoulder. "I do. I do." As Amber set the pie on the table and began to cut it, Loretta turned back toward the window. The brooch, her something blue, gleamed faintly in the dim light of the room, catching the last rays of the setting sun. It sparkled as if alive, the sapphire reflecting the quiet strength Loretta had found over the years. They sat together, the three of them, as the evening grew darker, the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside like a gentle lullaby. The soft flicker of candlelight cast warm shadows across the room, and the smell of fresh pie filled the air. Amber talked about her plans, her dreams, and Loretta listened, her heart full, as the brooch glittered softly on her sweater. She had fought for this moment, for herself, for Amber, and now she could finally rest, knowing that the legacy she had fought so hard to protect would continue on, in the hands of the one person who truly understood it. The storm had passed. The house, the brooch, the future. They were all hers again. And for the first time in a long time, Loretta allowed herself to believe in the peace that had finally settled over her home. Loretta sat at her desk, her fingers brushing over the brooch. It gleamed in the soft light of the room, the sapphire stone still as vibrant as the day she had received it. But it wasn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It was something far more significant, a symbol of all she had lost and all she had regained. Her hands were steady as she placed the brooch into a glass frame, the velvet interior lined with care, the sharp edges of the glass enclosing it forever. It would never be worn again, but it would always have its place. This was the legacy Loretta had claimed, the legacy she would pass on, not just through the material things she had fought to protect, but through the lessons she had learned. Amber would understand one day. Loretta stood back, admiring the frame. The brooch, now sealed in glass, would never be the same as it had been when it rested close to her heart. But in a way, that was fitting. It was no longer a token of her past, but a marker of her survival. A reminder of how far she had come. A quiet declaration of what she had taken back. The sound of footsteps outside her study door caught her attention, and Amber stepped in, holding a small box. Loretta had been waiting for this moment. The moment she could pass on the pieces of her history. The things that mattered. The things that Amber would need when Loretta was no longer there to guide her. Amber looked at the framed brooch, then back at Loretta. "What's this?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Loretta smiled faintly, placing the box in front of Amber. "For you," she said simply. "It's everything I've kept for you. Letters, photos, instructions." Amber opened the box carefully, her hands lingering on the edges as she lifted the contents. Inside, there were letters, written long ago, when Loretta had hoped for a future that now seemed distant. There were photographs of family moments, some happy, others tinged with the bittersweet. And there, at the bottom of the box, was a small, simple note. "When it's your turn, you will understand what I've done." Amber glanced up, her eyes questioning, but Loretta simply nodded. "These are yours now. I want you to have everything, everything that matters." Amber sat down beside her, still looking through the items, her fingers trembling as she touched the past Loretta had preserved. "You've kept this all for me?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. Loretta nodded, her own throat tight, though she didn't allow herself to show the emotion. "You need to know what came before. You need to know where you come from." As Amber continued to sift through the memories, Loretta felt the last of her doubts disappear. She had fought for this moment, for the legacy of strength and survival she had built with her own hands. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't the brooch. It was the knowledge, the wisdom that had been passed down, now placed in Amber's hands. Loretta moved to the small desk in the corner of the room, where her journal lay. She hadn't written in it in years, not since the days when she had tried to make sense of all that had been taken from her. But now, there was one last entry to make. A final act of reclamation. She picked up the pen and wrote in careful script, the words coming slowly but with purpose. "The moment I gave her everything, she took even more. Now it's mine again." Loretta set the pen down, the ink still fresh on the page. It was the truth, simple and direct. She had given her daughter everything. And in return, Kristen had taken everything Loretta had left, but no more. Now, Loretta had taken back what was rightfully hers. The evening passed quietly as Loretta and Amber sat together, the house now filled with a sense of peace that Loretta had longed for. They had talked, but not about the past. Instead, they talked about the future, about Amber's college acceptance, about the life she would build, about the world she would move into without the weight of old ghosts holding her back. When the evening deepened, Pearl arrived, her presence as steady as always. She carried with her a pitcher of sweet tea, her hands steady as she poured the amber liquid into 2 glasses. Loretta's heart was lighter than it had been in years, her resolve clearer than ever. The storm had passed, but the peace that followed was more than just a calm. It was the beginning of something new. The three of them stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening air settling around them. The night was quiet, save for the rustling of the leaves in the trees. The house, Loretta's house, stood still in the background, its doors closed to the past and open to the future. Pearl raised her glass. "To you, Loretta," she said, her voice warm with unspoken understanding. "You didn't just win, you sealed it." Loretta clinked her glass against Pearl's, her smile small but genuine. "I did," she replied, taking a long sip. The sweetness of the tea mingled with the warmth of the evening. "And it's ours now." As they sat in silence, the sound of children playing in the distance reached them. Their laughter carried through the neighborhood, rising and falling like the waves of an ocean. Loretta felt the full weight of their freedom, the finality of the choice she had made. And as the stars began to twinkle above them, Loretta glanced toward the street. 2 young kids, no older than 8 or 9, were walking past the house. They stopped when they noticed the sign on the gate, the one Loretta had hung just hours before. One of them pointed. "That's the witch house," the child whispered to his friend. Loretta's lips curled into a faint smile. She didn't need to respond, didn't need to explain. "I earned the name," she said quietly, her gaze steady as she watched them walk away. She had earned every bit of it. My daughter yanked the gift from my hands and said, "This isn't yours, old witch." So I took back everything she owned.